You are listening to episode 47 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Today we speak about the 12 insights of the Four Noble Truths with our friend Ron Stillman. One of the most overlooked aspects of our tradition, sometimes overshadowed by the unique strength of the Four Noble Truths, is another numerical designation of the 12 insights. These insights bring with them an expansion of how we understand and put the Four Noble Truths into practice. Each truth has 3 insights. One of explanation about what it is, that it must be understood, and that it has been understood. When taken together, these 12 insights bring a depth and richness to the meaning and practicality to what is often misunderstood as the mere philosophical aspect or dogmatic expression of Buddhism. Our guest today, Ron Stillman, was raised as a Mormon and began to question that tradition, eventually leaving it in search of a practice that resonated with him. His early experiences in Vipassana retreats helped him learn that he could let go of the story. Through this practice and deep study of the Pali Canon, Ron found himself questioning certain aspects of the teaching and how they apply to our real-world daily lives. Ron is an active participant in study groups on Buddhist theory and practice, and is a contributor on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice snow cone. Flavor of your choice, but it's winter, and I'm snowed in for the weekend, so snow cones for everyone. And we're here with Ron Stillman. Ron, thanks so much for being here.
Well, it's good to be here with you, Ted, and I thank you for this opportunity.
I'm very glad to have you here. Just for folks who are listening to the podcast, we've gotten to know each other, Ron and I, through our interactions on Facebook for the Secular Buddhist and through a Second Life group that we have for studying of some more of the more fine and esoteric points of Dhamma, shall we say. And one of the things that Ron has brought up several times, and he's quite right about that, is a particular part of the Dhamma that doesn't seem to get quite as much press as more compelling, charismatic points of the teaching. So I thought we'd get to that. But first, what I wanted to do is start, Ron, if you would tell us a bit about your background and how you came to have a particular kind of Buddhist practice that you're doing.
Okay. I guess I could go back a ways to, I was part of a religion, and I'll just say what it is. It's Mormonism. And I was born into it, and up until age 40, when I had a friend who was part of the church, who was in the church, and he started to send me some things about things that I'd never heard before, actually. It's kind of like on the other side of the coin. I'd seen one side, but I hadn't seen the other. And I was quite actually shocked at what I was reading. And took me a couple of years. I had some calls from the church indicating that I needed to do some things, otherwise I'd be excommunicated. And I had become inactive. So I decided to go ahead and carry forward with the excommunication. So I basically wrote a letter to them and said, please remove me from your roles. But I had probably a couple of years of quite a bit of stress around that because I was basically a true believer.
So your friend was sending you things they were striking in what way?
They were striking in a way that was showing me the changes that had been made in many of the let's say the writings of Joseph Smith, for instance, and also in the books. There's the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, and many words had been changed, and these were words that I had been taught. Those were the words of God because Joseph Smith was a prophet, and he was the one that gave the prophecies. So to all of a sudden see thousands of words being changed in different books, including the Book of Mormon, I became disillusioned, but not enough to actually, say I don't want to be a part of this any longer.
So it sounds like what you were faced with is that you had grown to believe, you were raised to believe that these were perfect and inerrant. This is the teaching itself, and it was something that could be counted on as being stable, and that you were suddenly faced with the possibility that wasn't the case, and that the practice that you were in, that tradition, the veracity of those words and their stability was a key component of that teaching.
Oh, absolutely. It's dogma, pure and simple, and you either believe it or you need to, my way or the highway sort of thing.
Yeah, if there's a problem here, it's not the words. It has to be you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that it sounds like that escalated in stress for you, and how did you deal with that as it went on and built?
It was very, very difficult because once you're a believer in something, you take on that identity. And that was certainly my case, and I'd gone on a mission, I'd been over to France, Belgium, northern France, and Luxembourg on a mission for 2.5 years, and I'd done everything that was required of me. And then all of a sudden to find out that this may not be the true church, right? The true church, the only true church, was deeply disturbing and confusing.
Yeah, it rocked your world. I mean, this was something. Yeah. This was one of the bedrocks of your mental health and happiness. And
well, yeah, my existence.
Yeah. So as this occurred, you separated out from the church. You decided, okay, there was just no hiding it, and it was something where you had decided, okay, time to make the break.
Exactly.
Was there any fallout that came out of that?
There was only the fallout from my family. I say only the fallout, right?
Yeah, little thing.
Yeah. So, my mother was disturbed by it. I did say that I had left the church. And, according to the teachings, once you get into heaven, there's a possibility of being with your family. That's part of some of the teachings. So, for her, it was basically, I wouldn't be with her in heaven. So this was disturbing, as you can well imagine. My brother, who I love very much, he was not okay with it either. And, I think that, it has contributed to, probably the relationship that we have now, which, I wouldn't say is very, very, friendly.
It's cooled a bit over the years, I imagine.
Yeah, yes.
Now,
right.
How did meditation and the concepts of early Buddhism enter the scene?
Well, this is further along in my history.
What got you there? Tell the story.
Well, okay. Yeah. So I was 40 years old when I wrote the letter and was, taken off the rolls of the church. And I went along for many years. That was, that would be 1984 when that occurred. So I became interested in Gurdjieff, G.I. Gurdjieff, and probably, I'm sure some of the listeners know about him. But he was, he taught many things, but one of the things that really was interesting to me was self-remembering. So it's basically know thyself. And this really caught my attention. So I was in a group, a Gurdjieff group, not one where they do the dances and those types of things. But this group, investigated different things like past life regression and, things of that nature. So I did that, but then that became something that really wasn't working for me. And so for many years, until 1999, when I first learned about Buddhism, I was living in Santa Cruz, California, behind my friend's house in an RV, and I had left the workaday world, and I was listening to an NPR program from San Francisco, and they were playing the audio of doing Vipassana. And that, I'll never forget listening to that and thinking...
Tell a little bit more about that, because I am familiar with that, but some of the listeners might not be.
Okay, doing Vipassana was a video, sort of a documentary, you might say, and it has to do with Goenka. Goenka was a man who lived in Burma. I believe he was affiliated with one of the, I don't know if it was Mahasi Sayadaw, but it was, and the Mahasi asked him to go back over to India and teach Buddhism because, that it hadn't been taught in India for a good long time, right?
Yeah, it lost its way, got booted out of the home country, yeah.
Right. So he subsequently did that, and in the process of doing that, many people became interested in it to the point where he was able to set up different centers around the world. I mean, it's quite a phenomenal story. And these centers would be set up so that you could do a 10-day retreat based on the teaching of Goenka, which was basically body scanning. And so that's what you did for 10 days. Essentially, for 10 or 12 hours, you would sit. There was no walking meditation, by the way. You would just sit, and you would be with whatever sensations came up in your body. Many of those, of course, for me, were quite painful in the beginning.
As they are for many people who've taken any of the 10-day retreats that Goenkaji's organization does. Tell us a little bit more about your first time doing one of those retreats.
That retreat, I started out and, there was pain. There was no getting around the bodily pain. And I really didn't know how to deal with that. I tried different sorts of, sitting on a bench, different sort of things to try to alleviate the pain that I had in my back. That was basically where the pain was. Plus in my knees, were in pain. And the whole thing with the Goenka retreat is to be able to come to a point where you can sit for 1 hour without movement. So, I didn't know if I would actually be able to make it. And it was about the 7th day that I realized that if I was to move my zabuton and my zafu, which is what they used, nobody, do I remember, sat on a chair, right? So you had to sit on the floor, on the ground. And I moved it back. I took the occasion to move it back there. Nobody ever said that I couldn't. And so I positioned myself up against the wall. And this was of a great help. And so by the time this, I think it was about the 8th day rolled around, I had felt this pain, and then I was all tied up in knots over it, right? It was like I was, I still didn't know what to do with it. And it occurred to me, what if I just let go of this tightness that was in my body? And so I let go of that tightness, and it was like a totally different experience. It was like the pain went away temporarily, not for very long, but it went away. But this was enough of an opening to show me that it's possible. And so subsequently, the pain, somehow I was able to be with it, to let go of the story around it, and I was able to sit relatively pain-free from then on out. It was quite an experience, I'll have to say.
You know, one of the things that I've always struggled with is having as an early experience with a retreat. Let's say you've been sitting for a while, for a number of months, I think you had at that point, but maybe not for this kind of duration. And
exactly.
One of the monks at Bhavana Society in West Virginia, I chatted with him about this because I had been doing retreats for a long time, and so I was familiar with what you're describing as well. And, you know, his words are really, this isn't a marathon. It's not about being in agony, and that's one of the things that I am challenged with sometimes, where there's this rule at the outset, which is you don't move and you're going to feel pain and you need to sit with it, and to some point, yes, but I think there comes a time at which you are now at a level of pain where any helpful and meaningful progress in one's meditation is derailed because you're in such physical discomfort that you haven't yet had any time for your mind to adjust, and here's how we deal with that. And so there's when you're doing a marathon, that's one reason I really like that comparison, is you need to work up to a marathon. You don't start by running 26.2 miles. You start by walking 10 minutes. And so the situations I hear like this, where it's, well, you need to be able to sit for an hour, that's great. Work up to it. Don't start by making someone sit for 12 hours a day. That's going to be something that may be, at least in my experience, maybe a little less helpful in their practice of mindfulness. That will be very helpful in their practice of experiencing agony, but that's not what meditation is about. So I always push back on that one a little bit. It just doesn't seem very helpful to me. But you got through it.
Got through it and learned something from it. Learned that I could actually let go of the pain, let go of the story. You know, the pain was still somewhat there, but even letting go of the story lessened the pain like I couldn't even believe. I couldn't believe it.
And it seems that's indicative of the difference between, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, that you're touching on the difference between pain and suffering. That you're able to let go of the suffering piece of it. Pain's still there, but so much of it, and perhaps more than we really realize, is our own mental gyrations about a pain, which may be significant. Often it really is a very high level of pain. But when we're able to disengage from our selfing and the story and the narrative about the physical pain, it just greatly reduces the experiential discomfort.
I would say right on, Ted.
Just guess. I'm just guessing here. I've never experienced that myself. So from that retreat, what did you take away from that, and where did you go from there?
After the retreat, we were given a possibility of joining up a small group in whatever town you lived in, if there was such a group, and there was in Santa Cruz. And so I went to that group, and they would play tapes of Goenka's talks, which I find to be a very, very well done, and I liked all of them. The ones I heard on retreat and anything that they played. I went to a few meetings, and I just decided I'd already started with another Sangha, a Vipassana Sangha, there in Santa Cruz 3 months prior to the retreat. And I had met some people there and had befriended some people. So I decided I'd go back there and continue there. That's what I did. I went there. They had a good Dharma teacher, and so that's what I did.
You had come from a background of having a very dogmatic faith tradition in Mormonism, and were somewhat disillusioned with that approach to spiritual practice. And you'd gone through a number of experiences and had found a Buddhist practice. And one of the things that I always like in our conversations in our Second Life group is that you ask questions about this teaching. And I was wondering if your experiences with Vipassana encouraged you to focus on the practice itself rather than the teaching, or enabled you to question with more confidence?
Okay. Very good question. What I started out with, of course, is what you normally start out with at the Sangha, and that is you work on the breath, right? It's basically breath. And they don't say that you can't use some other means of concentrating on something, but basically it's usually about the breath and how to breathe without trying to control it, and so on and so forth. So that's what I heard, and that's what I was taught, how to do that. And then there were Dharma talks that usually had something to do with, the 10 paramis, or 7 factors of enlightenment, or the 4 foundations of mindfulness, things of that nature. And so that was basically, those were the teachings that I heard. And not only in that Sangha, but I would also go up to Spirit Rock, and there would be similar talks up there for, like a day-long retreat, which is really a wonderful place. It's a wonderful place up there, and I really enjoyed it. But that's what we were taught. And so I basically went along with it. I went along with the basics and the Dharma talks on what I now call are the lists. And, and so I simply accepted it for what it was. Does that answer your question?
That does, very much so, and I'm glad you brought up the lists, because we're going to diverge for a moment into the Abhidhamma problem. Tell us about, because you and I have had this conversation before, and we continue to have this conversation about the Abhidhamma and it being a gathering of lists of stuff, and what your take on that has been.
It has been that I've started to wonder about certain things. And this has come about, by the way, not by just my thinking about something. I heard Dharma talk by Stephen Batchelor, who is looking at the earlier teaching and what's happened to it. And that started me to thinking, what is it about the early teachings that something may have happened to them? And so this was a question. And I also had read some talks by Buddhadasa about practical dependent origination. And of course I had not heard anything, no time did I ever hear, both in Santa Cruz as well as here in Albuquerque, did I ever hear anybody really teaching the dependent co-origination. It's like you heard everything else. I mean, you did hear, oh well, there's this dependent co-origination, and it has 12 links, and these are what they are, and then on to the next subject. Okay?
Right. It wasn't an investigation of, and here's what that means right now.
Exactly.
Here's an example, real world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then I heard just not more than 2 years ago, a Dharma teacher who I respect greatly now. His name is Philip Moffitt. He came to Albuquerque and did a half a day talking about his new book. It was new at the time, called Dancing with Life. And this turns out to be a book about the 12 insights of the Four Noble Truths. And so I'm thinking, when I'm listening to him, how is it that I've never heard this before?
That's true. I mean, we don't talk about the 12 insights and how we came to that. And, often in Buddhism, particularly in Theravada, we have these we have the Four Noble Truths, the 12 insights, we have the Eightfold Path, the this, that, the other thing with a numerical value attached, which of course helped in the memorization
exactly.
of the suttas. And so it of course makes sense that we would have that. And sometimes that's something that has a very direct and valuable meaning that we may not quite fully grasp. And when you'd first mentioned Phil Moffitt's book, Dancing with Life, and for those listening to the podcast, that is linked on the episode page for this episode, so people can take a look there. The 12 insights are something that we don't talk about quite as much, and how they really do have a direct impact on the practice. So, Ron, why don't you take us on a tour of the 12 insights?
Wow.
Just a tour, okay. It's a tour bus.
Yeah, well, I'll see if I can be brief. First of all, we need to recognize that this is found in the very first sermon of I'm going to say Gautama, okay? I don't mind Buddha. I don't mind the Buddha. I don't mind Siddhartha Gautama. But for our podcast, I'm just going to say Gautama. And Gautama taught this in the very first sermon to the ascetics.
Yep.
And in this,
yep.
Right. And he described this particular sermon as the handful of leaves. I don't know if you recall, or if the listeners recall, that there's the story about how, he said there's this forest out there. And it's, there's many teachings out there that, we can look at and probably they could be helpful. What I'm giving you now are the handful of leaves that can help you without having to go out into the forest looking for something, okay?
Yeah, it's looking at what is the most important without having to sort through all of it yourself.
Exactly. That's what I think he was trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I know, that this particular teaching included his entire teaching from what I've learned about anyway. And so this to me would naturally be something that one would want to know about.
Yeah, one would think, yeah.
Yeah. So why had I never heard about this in any of the Sangha meetings that I'd ever attended? This became the driving question for me. What happened? How could this be? So that's what I wanted to say first of all, that the Gautama's sermon to the ascetics, his very first sermon, if that includes his entire teachings, wow.
Yeah, one would think we'd want to take a look at this.
Exactly. So that, by means of Philip's book, because to me it has been so helpful to know how to work with these 12 insights, because even Stephen Batchelor says they're tasks to be done. To be done. Not to think about. To do. So this, like I say, got my attention and has held my attention since then. So I'm thankful to Stephen Batchelor. I'm thankful to Philip. I'm thankful to Buddha Dasa. I'm thankful to Santikaro, who was a monk and lived with Buddha Dasa for 19 years, because all of those people have influenced me, okay? That those conditions of hearing those different individuals and other Dharma teachers in my life, that has all contributed to where I'm at now.
Now, is this, you mentioned Santikaro, is this the one who is starting a community in Wisconsin?
That is correct, right.
I've actually heard him speak locally at Common Ground Center this past year, and I'm actually trying to get him on the podcast to talk about community, because he had a really good talk about that.
I guess that now the question to me became, what happened that these teachings were sort of forgotten in a way? Maybe that's too strong a word, or maybe they were obscured in some way. So that was the question I asked myself. How could this be? And I took it as a chance to solve a puzzle. I don't do regular puzzles. I know a lot of people really enjoy them a lot, and I have nothing against them. But for me, I like the puzzles where you have to go searching, right? I want to go searching.
You do those Hellraiser kind of puzzles where something bad can happen.
Yeah, like, I thought it was going to be this, but then they're saying this? Oh, no. How could that be?
Well, and that itself, to me, that's what's wonderful about what our interactions have been in this, is that we are questioning without reservation, that there is a sincere interest and desire to know, regardless of what answer is uncovered. That's what we want to get at.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
To be open to that.
And that's why I just started using the term, and I forgive me if someone else invented it first. I just started using it yesterday on one of the Facebook quotes I put out there, was that we question with confidence. And the meaning I have in there is that we are often in situations where we don't feel comfortable in our questioning. It is either discouraged or it is lip service to encouraging our questioning. But really, we have to come up with this specific answer. And if we don't, that's where problems get in. And
yes.
What I particularly like about our conversations, and one reason I'm having a secular approach to Buddhism, is that there isn't an adherence to what text says, because as we've shown and as is indicated in the Chanki Sutta, we don't know. We weren't there. we don't know what happened within the 7 generations back. We're taking the Kalama Sutta at its word, that we experience this for ourselves. And so I try to use that phrase that with secular Buddhism we can question with confidence, meaning that it is perfectly okay for us to question things and to find what is effective in our practice, because it is a very personal thing. It is very individual.
Yes. And
that's okay. And we find what works, and we cast aside what does not work. It doesn't mean it's not in some fashion true, but if it's non-contributory to our approach to the practice. Doesn't mean that a particular devotional approach isn't very effective as well. That's fine. But everyone's a little bit different. So we need to be able to question with confidence. Question with confidence. Use that phrase. Use it today.
Well, again, I would say, well said.
So talk about the 12 insights themselves. We've been using the phrase itself, but I know many of the listeners are either new to the practice, or they're coming from a tradition that doesn't look at things, or even those that do look at some of the ways we designate the teaching may not be as familiar. In fact, that's one of the problems you've identified, and that Phil Moffitt talks about in Dancing with Life, is that we don't look at 12 insights, so we don't have that knowledge of really what they are.
Okay. First of all, you could go to Access to Insight and pull up the first sutta, the first sermon, and Sometimes I have difficulty pronouncing it, but it's something like Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta.
The turning of the wheel.
The setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion, okay? So we hear a lot about the wheel of samsara, correct?
Yes, yep.
Makes also a question that has arisen for me is, well, if it was the setting of the wheel of Dhamma in motion, how did the setting of the wheel of samsara get involved?
It was the Big Bang. It was the Big Bang.
Okay. Anyway, that's I think that's important to keep in mind. So anyway, as you read down through the sutta, you come to a point where, and this is Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation, right? And so it says here, vision arose, insight arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose, illumination arose within me with regard to things never heard before. This is the noble truth of stress. This noble truth of stress is to be comprehended. This noble stress has been comprehended. Okay? And we could quickly run through the other three, but we need to come back to number one, because that to me is where you need to start. It's like a condition for the second one, and the second one a condition for the third, and the third condition for the fourth. And this came from Stephen Batchelor's talk, by the way. I don't want to take credit where credit is not due. Okay, I'm trying to let everybody know that is the case. So anyway, so the second one, vision arose, same thing, same wording, and then it comes to, this is the noble truth of the origination of stress. This noble truth of the origination of stress is to be abandoned. This noble truth of the origination of stress has been abandoned. That's number two. Number three, the same wording as before to begin with. This is the noble truth of the cessation of stress. This noble truth of the cessation of stress is to be directly experienced. Very important, as we well know. This noble truth of the cessation of stress has been directly experienced. Number four, this is the noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress. This noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress is to be developed. This noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress has been developed. Now, when I first read these words, and I'll have to say, I had never really looked at this sutta before, Ted. I had not really, because it had never really been taught in the Sangha. And so I went along with the lists. And now here we have this teaching, which, as you can tell, you can tell is something that we need to do. Okay, so let's go back to the first noble truth. And so, if you look at this is the noble truth of stress. We reflect on dukkha, right? We reflect on it. We think about it. It's like, oh well, this is dukkha in my life. This is stress in my life. So first of all, we reflect upon it. That's number one. Number two, and this is the most important one, and Philip makes this point in his book. In fact, he goes so far as to say that if you can simply do this next insight, you could just close the book and your life would be much more peaceful and calm. So this one, I put a lot of stress on it because he does. Okay.
Positive stress. Focus. We'll call it focus.
Okay. So it says, this noble truth of stress is to be comprehended. Now, Stephen has a little bit different translation of that. It is to be fully known. Okay, what could that possibly mean? To fully know dukkha. To fully know stress. That means that one would need to, in effect, notice that the stress has arisen, and then the way I look at it is to turn around and to understand, to comprehend, to know what it is in the mind-body, which normally is, it manifests as, for me, tightness in the stomach. In certain cases, I feel like I'm going to get a headache. My brain feels like it's expanding. And this is something that I have not wanted to look at before, okay? This is not something that I think most of us want to really look at, because once you start to look at it, other things start to manifest themselves in terms of insights.
Yeah, as we were talking a little bit about this yesterday before the interview, that this is one of the hardest things in our practice, and in particular meditation, is that unswerving facing up to what's going on. And particularly when we're talking about something like stress, suffering, dukkha, however we want to translate that word, it's discomfort of a fashion.
Yes.
When we look at that, what you're describing is often what therapists that we talked with on the podcast before have described this, where they take a person through closely examining what do we actually mean when we say we are, some emotion, fill in the blank. We take a look at that, and we can kind of tease apart. There's, as you're describing, tightness in the stomach, dizziness or head hurts. There's a great plethora of possible combinations depending on what it is, and the individual. Individual tastes may vary. Your mileage may vary. But looking at that is very uncomfortable, especially to start. And as we do so, and as we use the foundations of mindfulness, as we look at form, feeling, perception, mental formations, all that, we see that it's not as we initially thought of it, that it is components, and they're in combination, and they are constantly arising and falling, and it is a constant process. And where I think what Phil is talking about here, and as we're chatting right now, is understanding that, comprehending that, fully knowing that is critical to our being able to disassemble that and let that go.
That's why it is so important. And now, to talk a little bit about that, because what normally would happen for me is, first of all, I was afraid to do it. And it was only because I was part of the group that we met from middle of January to the middle of November of this year, and it's only because of that group that it happened for me. And so I can't do it by myself. I mean, we have too many biases in our perceptions. We need help. I'm sorry.
We do, and that's the friends in the practice. That's what we're there for, is to provide that mirror and that feedback.
Which is very important. So what do we normally do? What we normally do when we're faced with our stress, what do we normally do?
Hide away from it.
How about go turn on the TV? How about go look at reality TV? I'm not saying that these are things that are not to be done. Okay?
Right.
I respect people who do it. I respect whatever anybody is doing out there, as long as it's not harmful. I mean, I don't respect that. But, this is what we do. So we do distraction. And we do it very well in this culture. I can get on my computer and I can get lost in my computer and never even worry about the stress that I had at work. Okay? I forget about it, right? It's a way of forgetting about it. So to me, this is the big bugaboo. If you're going to turn around and face the dukkha, you've got to recognize that you're also distracting yourself every time, even when you have the intention to do it, which is what happened to me. I almost distracted myself when I really needed to be paying attention to the dukkha that was arising in my life. So it's a habit. It's a habit. That's how I look at it.
I think you're absolutely right, because we develop that habit of, this is where delusion comes in, deluding ourselves as to what's actually going on, because there is a misperceived comfort in avoiding that. And although it's true, we may be temporarily putting the symptoms of our suffering in abeyance, the causes are still there. The conditions are still there. We haven't gotten rid of them.
Exactly.
Okay, so needs to be comprehended and fully known.
Mm-hmm.
Then moving on from there.
Well, I don't know what more to say. It's something you've got to do, and there are other really wonderful teachings in this first sermon. I actually, really, I've come to love this sermon now, as you can well imagine.
Yeah.
I don't know anything more to say except I come back to the question of how is it that it's not taught anymore?
Yeah, that particular component, I think what you're identifying here is that in the suttas, you can blast through a sutta, it's only a couple pages long, and say, yep, I read that sutta. And that's a very different thing than reading it in our approach to, say, poetry. I mean, we just had the episode that just got put out was on haiku, that there is a great depth of meaning, a density in meaning in a very small amount of words that we recognize with poetry. We see that, and I think in particular haiku, it is such a small, manageable bit, we can really plumb those depths of that moment. Mm-hmm. Where it's an entire sutta, we tend to look at it, to read it as prose and go through it without that eye of each sentence itself can have that density. And that,
yes, yeah, and it's there's feeling gets involved with this, emotion arises, it's a creative wonder, right?
Well, and that's one of the things that we run into is how we present what can appear to people as being very dry, as being incredibly uplifting and meaningful in the transformation of our lives, is how we get that excitement and that passion about it. And that's what you're describing here. And I think that the most important part to take away from this is in the reading of the suttas, if you're going through the Pali Canon and you're looking at some of the translations, or if you're, my hat's off to you if you've learned Pali. That's awesome. I can barely speak English, so that's great.
No.
Learn something else.
Haven't done that, but yet I leave that to Stephen Batchelor.
Yeah, I leave that to people who are much smarter than I am. That an important thing we take away is that we really savor and examine and fully know, to use that turn of phrase of Stephen's, what is being said and what the implications of those are. And I think that's where we touch on, there's the reflection. We've heard about something and we're now actually taking it in, we're savoring it, we're tasting it, we're really getting that feel of it and what it means. And that it needs to be fully understood, not just a surface reading. Yeah, I read that. Life is suffering, dukkha. Okay, on to number 2. No, there's more to it than that. It's what do we actually mean? What is going on when we have this discomfort, this imbalance? And that once it has been comprehended, so we've got the next phase in this, there's actual a progression, and that helps us then build from one part to the next. And it's not to say that we can't have these occurring in a simultaneous fashion. We can't be working on them all at the same time. But that there are parts to just the first truth of suffering that it can be broken down, and there is a greater meaning that we don't always look at. And as you're saying here, Ron, it's something that isn't being taught a great deal, that depth of examination of what it is.
Well, if it is being taught out there, the only two people that I know of, like I think I mentioned before, would be Philip Moffat and Stephen Batchelor. Those are the only two that I know of. And there may be others out there, but I don't know them.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Ted, the implications. Okay.
Yeah.
And would you like me to say something about what happened to me when I actually made the commitment and the intention to face my own dukkha?
Yes, please, because intention is so very key. Yes, tell us about that.
Right. So in our little group, we came to the point of the first noble truth and the second insight. And I resolved, I aspired, I made an intention that the next dukkha that I would be able to recognize, having enough concentration and mindfulness, which you have to have some of that. Then I was be able to go ahead and feel whatever was going to happen in my body mind. And so with that intention, I had been faced with a situation that I had at work. It actually was a situation where I'm a paratransit driver here in this town that I live in, and I'd worked for the city. The city had run the service for me. I'd been in it for 6 years, and all of a sudden it was going to be transferred to a regional transportation agency. And it was going to be that I would be put on probation for, in our case, it turned out they wanted 1 year and we were able to get it down to 3 years because, let's face it, we had some experience, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a colleague who was quick to remind me, and he'd been in management before, and he said, "Okay, we're on probation. You realize they can let you go for any reason whatsoever. If they want their son-in-law or their uncle to join, up, they can very easily get rid of you and put them on." So you can imagine what I started to do about that.
Perhaps a little stress arose.
A little bit, and stories about, well, what if they do this, right? So fear arose.
Mm-hmm.
There was fear. I admit it. And there was a day where I was out picking up passengers, and I got a call over the radio. We have two-way radios in all the buses, of course, because we have to be in touch with each other all the time. So I got this call from the new supervisor, and this is what he said. He said, "What is your ETA," which means estimated time of arrival, for those who are not familiar with that terminology. "What's your estimated time of arrival to such and such an address to pick up this passenger?" And I was running a little late. And I don't like to run late, okay? It's one of my unfortunate preferences, right? And unfortunately, in what we do run late, we just for various reasons, which I won't go into. But I've got this call, and it put the fear of dukkha arose, okay? Anxiety arose, stress arose, because the story I started to tell myself was, this supervisor is now looking at me with the evil eye. Okay, I didn't use that term, but in other words, he's focused on me, and he's seeing that I'm running late, and this will be grounds for my termination. Okay, so I'm faced with termination. Now, this is no small thing. I call this gross dukkha. There's also, I call these things different names. I have subtle dukkha, which is the stuff that's happening to us on a daily basis, but we really don't notice it very much. And there's gross dukkha, and I maintain that there's everything in between those two. Like a spectrum. It's like a spectrum. And it just depends on how gross it is. Okay, so anyway, here I am running this story. I'm going to be terminated. And I realized that this is it. This is the dukkha that I've been waiting for. Oh, thank you very much.
What an opportunity.
Yeah. And so, this was it. And so I immediately I asked myself in my head, I said, what's the feeling like in my body? And what's the feeling like in my mind? Because the mind-body, as we know nowadays, is connected. Didn't used to be that way. But, so I look at my body and I'm tense. I'm really tense. I'm really tense. I feel in my head, it feels like my brain is expanding against the inside of my skull, and it's getting warmer up there. I don't know, people can probably relate to this. It's like there's a tingling in your brain. And to me, this is the sensation, this is the way I describe it. Moreover, I found out that I wasn't able to think very well. And if I hadn't have been on top of this thing, I could have easily passed the fellow street and continued on to some point in time where I would have realized that how could I just missed the street.
Therefore,
right?
Made yourself even more late.
Exactly. So it's not helpful. Okay, this is what we need to notice, that this kind of stress is not helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's part of it, in my opinion. So anyway, moving right along. When I faced the dukkha, okay, this is facing the dukkha, I couldn't believe what happened next. It was like I really could not believe it. There was this sudden lessening of the dukkha. What didn't last very long. Probably maybe 5-10 seconds at the most. And then the story came back again because it was gross.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was still afraid. And then I had to do it all over again. Okay, so there it is. So I'm letting go a little bit more, right? I'm actually in the process of letting go of the tightness, and the sensation in my brain is starting to lessen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, what? This is amazing. This is amazing,
mm-hmm.
right? I may be exaggerating a little bit here, but that's how it felt to me.
Well, and what you're describing here is the same experience that you had on that retreat with the physical.
Exactly. Yeah, that did come to mind. Definitely came to mind. Here is a similar situation, and definitely they're the same thing. They're the same thing.
So something for folks who are listening to the podcast, if you haven't done this before, something to consider is when a situation arises soon, and it'll happen, because it always does, where stress is arising. It's difficult for us to even notice it and look at it as separate from ourselves. That can be a very, very difficult part, and that's part of the full knowing of dukkha, is that it's not us. There's not a me involved. This is a separate thing. This is part of a process. And try out what Ron is suggesting here and what we do in our meditative practice, which is observing that clearly and fully and not shy away from it. And a possible outcome of that, and I would suggest one that does occur with some degree of likelihood, and I can say that with fair confidence as one's practice progresses a great deal, is that it lessens, because we are no longer attached to a particular outcome, and the papancha, the proliferation of, oh my goodness, and all these thoughts which just feed back into it and make it worse and going to raise the pressure in the pressure pot that's our mind, that doesn't happen. We disengage that more successfully and more consistently as time goes on. Ron, is there anything you'd like to add onto that?
Yes, just to sort of, probably we're getting close to the end here because I know we've talked quite a bit. I'd like to say what happened after this happened.
Yeah,
okay?
Please.
What were the results of this facing one's dukkha? What I noticed right away was my mind was more focused and less susceptible to distraction. Less susceptible. The other thing was I noticed an increase of energy. It was like this huge burden had been relieved from my shoulders. That in and of itself was huge for me.
Yeah, because you no longer were spending energy dealing with stress.
Exactly. And I noticed that I became friendlier to people in a sincere way, not in a made-up way, not in a synthetic way. I noticed that right away. And also I noticed that there was this sort of creativity that was going on in my brain. It was like, well, gee, what if you were to try this, and what if you were to do that? It's something that I'd never really been connected with before. So that was really, really something. I felt happier, and I still feel happier. I'm not saying that dukkha still doesn't arise, because it does, and I still have to deal with it. And so these to me are priceless. That's how I would describe these conditions. This is the result. I would describe them as priceless.
And every moment we have an opportunity to transform what's occurring in our lives and how we respond to it. Ron Stillman, thank you so much for being here. I've enjoyed this, and I'll be chatting with you in the next couple days online.
I enjoyed it too very much, Ted, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.